Morning class, this is CAS 303. Today we're covering rhetoric as well as dramatistic criticism with Kenneth Burke. I have other videos on this for my classes. If you take 301 in the fall, you'll be better versed in rhetorical theory. We don't go into it too much in this video, but there are other videos for when you take my other classes. We're just going to cover some of the basics that are important for this class. And for dramatistic criticism, I actually have another video. It's down in the comments below that you need to watch. So make sure that you watch all the videos that I've posted today. This one is a short little one, and then I have two additional videos that I'm asking you to watch that are down below in the comment section, and they're also posted up on Canvas. All right. Again, these are just sort of short introductions because I do have longer videos for this when we go into more detail in rhetorical theory, CAS 301, which if you haven't had me in the fall yet, you might have me in this coming fall 2021. All right, so first let's start with this idea of rhetoric. For those who have had me many times, you all know that I like to define rhetoric or sort of rhetorical criticism, the field of rhetoric, those who are involved in the study. It's the study of messages and their persuasiveness. So sometimes, people think of rhetoric as just, the idea of talking. That's not necessarily what it is as a field or as a discipline. If you consider yourself to be a rhetorician, what you are doing as an academic exercise in that regard is you're studying messages and the persuasiveness of those messages. So it can get into questions of whether or not it's good or bad, what the messages do, but it's not just sort of looking at how people talk or what people are saying, but it's actually, is their form and function of talking, is it persuasive with regard to telling a story, political policy, changing the culture, etc. All right. So there's lots of sort of form, function, characteristics, methods of persuasion, methods of appeal that go into this, which we'll talk about, I guess, now. All right. So we start off with Aristotle. Aristotle, he sort of begins the process of sort of studying how to make an argument. And his study of making an argument is very functional. So Aristotle's idea is that if people are all rational beings, then we just need to figure out, we just need to teach people how to create the most rational argument, and the best argument will win. All right, so it's just sort of putting together claims and evidence and warrants, and then the best evidence is going to rise to the top, and we're going to have a nice functioning political society because things are going to be done rationally, right, through the logos. There was this other guy came along a couple of hundred years later named Cicero, who I have a video down below that you need to watch. The first 15 minutes is on Cicero and Persuasion, so make sure you watch that. Cicero said rhetoric isn't just about function, just about making a good logical argument, but there's also the form of it, right? So there's this charismatic part of it. We know that the best politician, or excuse me, the politicians with the best ideas, logically speaking, they don't always win the elections, right? People are drawn to political candidates based on things like how warm is this candidate? Do you feel a kinship with this candidate? Which candidate do you identify with? Does this candidate feel your pain, right? Which is a sort of a Bill Clinton slogan from the 1990s, right? So this sort of trope of Bill Clinton is he would go around and he would say, like, I feel your pain to people, right? So you sort of feel warm, the politician's charismatic, and if you really think about it for longer than 30 seconds, you realize it doesn't really matter if the politician identifies with me. It only matters is if his or her policies are implemented in a way that actually creates positive effects in my life, right? In all for all intents and purposes here, yeah, like we really shouldn't care whether or not a politician like feels our pain or understands us, or we could have a beer with them. That stuff shouldn't matter. But it does, and Cicero understood this. Cicero understood that the charismatic abilities of public speaking was just as important as whether or not it made logical sense. All right, so there's plenty of politicians. You can make a list of them, and don't just think that they're on the other side, right? There's plenty of politicians in your own party, whatever party you identify with. There's plenty of politicians who are they're just all form. There's no substance behind them. They're performative, right? They just say the things that will kind of get them chummy, handshaking and kissing babies. They're just like they're in there, and you feel like they're your friends and your buddies. But then you start to dig into it, and you realize like they have absolutely no substance behind them. They don't have any facts. They're not talking about budgets. They're not talking about the minutia of spending priorities and inflation and tax policy. They literally know nothing about the details of these bills that they are passing. They just sort of say like, well, it just feels like the morally right thing to do. And you're like, but does it actually elicit any positive changes, or is your politics all about, the feels? And there's plenty of politicians, again, they're on both sides. So you can find them in your own political party, whatever your political party is. And if you refuse to find them, then you're just a partisan ideologue. But there's plenty of politicians who, again, they just go around saying exactly what it is that you want to hear. And so we know that those politicians are persuasive because they deal in what's known as pathos primarily, as opposed to logos. So logos, pathos, ethos, you've probably heard this before in like a high school debate class. These are the three ways that a speaker can appeal to an audience. So you have the logos, which is the logic. Here's all the facts. But again, we know that people who only spout facts can be very, very boring when it comes to persuasive speaking. These are not the people that they're putting on cable news, right? Cable news enjoys charismatic figures who denigrate the other party, who say outlandish things. These are the people who get attention, so we're going to put them all over the news, right? So beyond logos, beyond just having facts, Cicero, so this is very Aristotelian. Cicero, he did have facts, right? I'm not saying Cicero had no facts, right? But but Cicero also said, look, there's pathos involved. And what pathos is those emotional connections that people can create, those emotional connections that people can make to the facts and the details, right? So it is good to have a story, right? To have some sort of emotional story. So if you are trying to get funding for cancer research, it's not enough just to give the facts about cancer research, but you also have to get into the details of telling a personal story of someone who's dealt with cancer, right? That sort of pulls on the heartstrings, right? It's not enough just to say like, here's the money situation with regard to welfare, but it's like, let's also tell a story about a single mom trying to raise 3 kids, working minimum wage jobs. You're like, oh, that makes me, feel sad, all right? So pathos is important. Now, here's the thing. If a politician only engages in pathos, right? Only engages in emotional arguments, this is what we call a demagogue, right? They're committing demagoguery, right? And what this means is an over-reliance on emotional arguments, and they actually have no substance with regard to logos behind them. So if you ever run into a politician and they're only telling sad stories, and then you say, okay, what's the current tax system? And they say, well, I don't know, that doesn't matter, right? But for taxes, let's say they go around and they say, here's a bunch of poor people, and we just need to tax the rich more because here's a person who is poor and they need health care and they need child care and they need a boost in the minimum wage, and we need to pay all these things for them because look how sad this person is, and we need to make their life better. And then you say, okay, well, tell me the details of the current tax policy, and then we can sort of work around the edges and figure out, what the different tax policy should be. And they say, no, that doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't matter what the actual facts are. I'm just going to tell you sad stories about all these other people. So if you ever come into contact with a politician who is only ever telling you sad stories and they can't actually articulate the current policy and they can't articulate what their policy would propose and how it's actually going to make the situation better, you start to get worried like this politician is just a demagogue. They actually don't know anything about the wonkiness of the numbers involved in order to achieve the thing that they want to achieve. A story I've told before in some of my classes is I got into a tax argument with a friend. It's a very friendly argument. Her and I argue a lot on things, and then we say, okay, let's go have a drink and let's have fun tonight. But we got into a very heated argument on tax policy and what, whether taxes should be higher or lower, et cetera, et cetera. And her thing was, she just kept saying like, tax people more, we need more taxes, we need more taxes. I said, let's pause for a moment. I said, what is the current tax structure look like? Can you just tell me what the current tax brackets are? She says, no. She's like, I don't deal with numbers. That was her response to me asking for basic information with regard to how much do people currently pay in taxes percentage-wise? How much do you pay currently in taxes percentage-wise? And what do you think what do you think the new tax bracket should be if you want to completely overhaul the tax system? And she says, I don't deal in numbers. That's when I look at her, I'm like, okay, you've just been listening to demagogic politicians who just say taxes a lot and it's emotional, but they actually don't know what's the current tax code, how much do you currently pay in taxes, how much do you propose we pay in taxes, what's the right number? And if someone says, I don't know, or I don't really care, my answer is just like more taxes, or my answer is lower taxes, but you don't actually have the numbers of how taxes work, then you're just a demagogue. You're only dealing in pathos. Don't deal in pathos, or don't deal solely in pathos, all right? You need a logos foundation, right? You need that Aristotelian part, that logos. You need that more Ciceronian part, which is pathos, right? And then finally you have ethos, this ethos appeal. Roughly translated into ethics, I like to think about it for our purposes as credibility, all right? So does the speaker have credibility? So sort of this like, who is the speaker? Which is, if a speaker comes to campus and they say, I'm a politician who deals with tax policy, you sort of give them some sort of credit because they have sort of earned that role. They're the ones who are writing the laws, right? Professor has initial credibility, right? The fact that I have 3 little letters after my name gives me some credibility in the classroom, right? So if you have, again, this sort of ethos appeal. Now, you, as an undergraduate student, sorry to say, we've all been there, right? You don't have any credibility yet, all right? So what you have to do, and this is why APA citations are important, not only for you, but APA citations are also important for people with PhDs, right? Is you get what's called derived credibility. So when I ask you to write papers and cite your sources, that's what you're doing. Because if you write me a paper on dramatistic criticism, right, as one of your theory papers, I look at you and I'm like, you're not an expert in dramatistic criticism. You don't have a PhD in it. How am I supposed to believe you? And you say, well, look at all these sources that I have cited of other people who do have histories, who have PhDs, who have lots of publications. You're getting derived credibility by citing other people. So this is why it's important to cite things like academic journal articles as opposed to Wikipedia, right? So imagine that, like, think about the way in which you carry sources. That's your sort of non-verbal way of signaling to the academic world that, what you've done is important, right? So there's lots of ways that we look at other people and, people are giving us advice. Like, let's say a financial person is trying to give you, like your friend is trying to give you financial advice, and you look at them and you're like, you're broke. Like, why are you giving me financial advice? Like, you're broke, right? Or your friend's giving you like exercise and diet advice, and you're like, you haven't worked out in 5 years. Like, why am I listening to you? The same thing is true in academia, right? If you're going around and saying like, ooh, Dr. Phillips, I have something important to say, and I say, oh, where'd you find that? Ooh, some like weird corner of the internet, or I looked it up on Wikipedia, or, my friend told me this like third hand, or I saw it on some weird blog, right? Some weird internet channel that everything's conspiratorial. That's when I look at you and I'm like, that's what you want to be connected with, right? No, if you want credibility, you should be citing academic journal articles, all right? That's how you gain credibility when you give a speech. So it's not just about writing a paper to try to get it over with, but it's about writing a paper in a way where your credibility is ironclad. So you want to surround yourself with academic research that is ironclad, because that's a reflection of you, right? So if you want to have a good reputation, you want to surround yourself with good people, right? You want good people to speak up for you. If you want to have a good academic reputation, you need to surround yourself with good scholarly sources, right? If you want to have a good financial reputation for giving, good sound financial advice, like, you need to have a real solid bank account and portfolio for yourself, all right? So that's what this is all about. So don't just look at academic research and say, oh, Dr. Phillips just wants us to cite journal articles because, he's mean and wants to make it harder, and going to Wikipedia is easier. No, like, citing good academic research actually makes you look better, all right? So logos, pathos, ethos, know what they are, all right? Logos is the logical appeal. Here are the numbers. Pathos is the emotional appeal. Do you feel connected to the material? And ethos is the speaker's credibility. All right, briefly, and again, I go more in depth in other classes, so I'm going to just rush through this quick, right? So there were these individuals back in the day known as the soffits, right? And these were teachers of public speaking, all right? So these were individuals who would go around and teach people how to be public speakers, how to have, how to create an argument. The scaffolding approach is what it's known. It's like, here's your solid sort of baseline introduction, and then you stack on some evidence and some claims and some warrants, and then you kind of go in this direction of a story. So you tell a little pathos, and then you come back and you bring in some more facts and data, right? You're sort of layering your credibility onto making a good persuasive argument. Now, these individuals were looked at with some skepticism by people like Socrates, because Socrates was concerned, and I think rightfully so, that the soffits were teaching public speaking in a manner that said, here's how to go out and be the most persuasive person and win an argument. And Socrates was like, it shouldn't be about winning an argument, right? A debate shouldn't be about winning, right? It shouldn't be me versus you, and I'm going to try to win, because winning an argument is like winning by any means necessary, right? So I could be a little bit manipulative. I could cherry pick my facts. I could sort of leave some facts behind because I don't want the audience to see those facts, because those facts would hurt me, right? So teachers of public speaking, the soffits, they were like, here's how to be an eloquent speaker, and here's how to win an argument. And people like Socrates were saying a debate shouldn't be me versus you, one person wins, one person loses. Socrates says we should both be trying to argue with each other as a way to help build each other up so both of us can get closer to the truth. So that's what Socrates thought arguments and debates should be about. It wasn't about one person winning. It was about both of us bringing our ideas to the table, because in a debate, both of us are really confused about a subject. Whatever the hard subject is, both of us have some information and are lacking other information. So we have to talk to other people who have different ideas than us to kind of sharpen our ideas, and then hopefully it's like, oh, I have some things correct, but you have other things correct, and now at the end of that debate, we are both closer to what is the true correct answer with regard to this topic at hand. All right, this gets into some stuff with John Stuart Mill on liberty that I've talked about in other videos that you can watch if you want. Yeah, but this idea that you should go into a debate, and this is, one of the reasons that we talk about free speech in some of the classes, that this idea that you don't have all the answers, and so it shouldn't just be about like you dominating the conversation to win. It should be about you throwing out some information, and maybe you're 90% right, but this person you're debating is 10% right, and you need some of that information from them in order for both of you to better strengthen your response to whatever the problem is. All right, so soffits were teaching people how to speak publicly in order to win debates, in order to win political positions, right? Socrates was a little bit skeptical of them, because Socrates is saying debate shouldn't be about winning. Debate should be about both of us moving closer to what is actually true. We talked a little bit about Aristotle and Cicero already. All right, Aristotle was concerned with the function, right? So does this make logical sense? And Aristotle was like, well, if it's rational, then the most rational argument will win. Cicero came along a little bit later, and Cicero said, no, the form is also important. It's important to be charismatic. I have a video on Cicero. Watch it down below. The end. This sort of like these public speaking schools were called elocutionary schools. You would go to school to learn how to be, to speak well. All right. So these types of schools existed. In some form or fashion, you can think about like finishing schools, which was sort of a name for a school back in the day. Like young ladies would go to these schools, and you've seen these old movies where they're carrying books on their head so they stand up straight, and they're learning how to use knives and forks at a dinner party. They would also go to these elocutionary lessons, right, and learn how to speak properly. All right. Okay, so watch the video on Cicero down below. It'll give you more info. Finally, as far as types of rhetorics, there's forensics, epicdidic, and deliberative. Forensics is just the type of speech that is about good or bad. So this is what lawyers do in a courtroom. We're just trying to figure out what the facts are. What's right, wrong, what's good, bad. Like we're trying to persuade each other with regard to what the facts are. That's forensics. We're trying to find the truth. All right. Epicdidic is more of an emotional speaking. So think about ceremonies, church eulogies, right? You go to somebody's funeral, you're giving praise or blame to somebody. It's just emotional. All right. And then finally, deliberative is if a politician or an activist is trying to give you some sort of call to action, like I need you to go out, I need you to do something. That's deliberative speaking. You're trying to sort of speak things into existence, right? Speech act theory is sort of in this regard. Like what I say sort of does create actions within the audience. All right, know those three. They're on the test. All right, now we're going to get into dramatistic criticism. I'm going to go through this quick because, again, I have the second video I have down below is on dramatism and Kenneth Burke. It goes into more details. So watch the Cicero video, watch the dramatistic video for today. All right, so there's this guy named Kenneth Burke. There's more details, and there's a bio section in the other video. Watch it. But long story short, Burke's theory of dramatistic criticism compares life to a play. And states that in a theatrical piece, life requires actors, scenes, action, agency, and purpose. The theory allows rhetorical critics to analyze the speaker's motive by examining these elements. Furthermore, Burke believes that guilt is the ultimate motive for speakers, right? Dramatism suggests that rhetors are most successful when they provide their audience with a means for purging their guilt. And we'll give some examples of this, right? Very Shakespearean, right? All life is a stage, and the men and women are merely actors in it. The way in which you move through the world is is very theatrical, is very performative, and there's very predictable ways in which you are going to act because the only way that you know how to act is by mimicking the behaviors of people who have come before you. So an easy example of this is one day if you're going to become a parent, you're going to have a baby the first time, and you're like, what do I do with this baby? And you're like, oh, I'm going to act in the ways in which I've seen parents act, my own parents act. I'm going to mimic my own parents. I'm going to mimic parents I've seen on TV or read about in books or what have you, right? So we're sort of mimicking. It's all this sort of theatrical. We act in according to scripts. We learn how to be a student by watching other students. We learn how to be an athlete by watching other athletes. We're just sort of mimicking behaviors. Here's the pentad. I go into more detail on the pentad on the video below, so I'm not going to worry about it right now, but these things are just all connected. All right, watch the video below for more info. I also explained this, but real quickly, the agent is the person who's performing the act, right? So, you know, you could be the agent. The act is sort of like the context in which that thing is being done, right? The scene is the setting, right? And also, you know, the context of the act, right? So we're sort of starting with the agent. The agent is acting within context, the scene, right? We're getting a little bit bigger. We kind of keep going out and out and out. Yeah, as far as the way that this is building, all right? And again, you can think about this as like a sitcom, all right? But then you sort of apply it to real life, all right? Agency is the ways in which like people have different levels of agency. So there are constraints around how you can act. This is what we talk about when we say like you have a certain amount of agency, right? So your strategies of communication could be limited by how much agency you have. So for instance, if you are in the mailroom at this large corporation, you can act, but you can only act a little bit, right? If you have a problem with the way the company is being ran, there's only a few things that you can do. So your agency is rather limited. If you're the CEO of the company, you have agency, but your agency is much broader with regard to changing the structure of the corporation. All right. So the agency is the way in which you act in accordance with the level of trying not to, you know, not trying to say agency again, but it is like it's the level of agency you have. It's the level of influence that you have. All right, you can only act in so many ways, and so much of the way that you act is constrained by the context with regard to where you are in that certain situation. Now, in some places, you might have a lot more agency than other places. In the classroom, for instance, you have a limited amount of agency because I'm the professor, right? And so I get to sort of craft the syllabus and you're the student, right? In your home life, right? Or if you're the manager at your job, you have a lot more agency, right? So a manager at a workplace has a lot more agency than maybe a student in a classroom. All right, and then purpose, which is just sort of like, what's the end goal of your communication? Like, why are you communicating at all? Like, what are you trying to get out of this communication? All right, if you're trying to sort of change the business model, you're trying to create more profits, you're trying to leverage yourself for a raise at work, that could be the purpose for the way in which you're acting. When it comes to relationship discussions, a lot of the purpose is just sort of maintain the relationship. So in 203, which is interpersonal communication, which I teach in the fall, we talk a lot about this, right? when people think about idle communication, there's no reason to communicate. It's not necessarily true. Uh, there's ways in which you communicate with your loved ones that doesn't serve any sort of tangible purpose except for the fact to sort of just maintain the relationship. When you sit around and talk to like small talk, you sit around, you talk about the weather, how was your day? There's no sort of end goal for like, expanding profit margins, right? But it's like you talk to people in order to maintain those relationships. You check in with your boyfriend, girlfriend, family members, etc. Just to, kind of stay tribal, to keep connected, all right? So that could be the ultimate purpose. All right, substance is the general nature of something. So who are the people? How do they identify? What is their substance? Okay, so that's where we're starting here. How do people interact? Well, first and foremost, we need to know the characters. We need to know the agents in the scene. All right, that's the substance. Identification is when people have overlapping substances. So we think about Venn diagrams. All right, so this is me, this is you, and then we have some things in common in the middle. All right. Okay. So can I identify with you? If you are trying to persuade somebody, and let's say that you and that person have very different political ideologies, the first thing that you should probably do in your speech is try to find some sort of common denominator with regard to how you identify, or things that you have in common. So one of like a hard conversation might be something like gun control. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm very pro-gun and you're very anti-gun. Well, I'm not going to just go in there and say, like, you're an idiot and your position's wrong, and you're not going to do the same to me. Oh, you could, but it's going to end the conversation, right? Nobody's going to listen to you if you start off with you're an idiot. So the first thing you want to come in is both of us want to say, look, we're different. We have a lot of difference as far as policy, but what are things we have in common? Okay. There's violence that happens with guns, and both of us want to reduce the amount of violence that's happening with guns, because we don't want any more violence in the world, right? We don't want to see people who are, dying unnecessarily. Great. Okay, let's start there. All right, and then we sort of build policy from what we have in common. All right, so that's the identification part. Even when we're different, even when both of us have different substance, right? What things do we have in common? That's the identification. Division is when people sort of fail to overlap, and it's just like we're too different, we're too far apart here that there's nothing that we have in common that we can build from. Unfortunately, this happens too often. And I do think, and I think it's unfortunate because I think a lot of people who have different political beliefs, I think they have a lot of identification with each other, but I think that, I don't want to do like the whole, like the media, but I think it is, partially the media. They play on our divisions because, and I think they have to, because for the reason that their news networks exist is to play on those divisions, because it's like they need to give you a reason to watch, Fox News, or they need to give you a reason to watch MSNBC. And if both networks are the same, if both networks are talking about identification, then it doesn't really matter if I go over and watch Fox or I go over and watch, MSNBC. So what these news networks do is they heighten the division because they say, look, there's a reason to come over to Fox News because, they identify with that like small part of me that's more Fox News and more sort of like all encompassing, right? Or MSNBC will say, no, like we're going to heighten this aspect because like we know that you really don't like Donald Trump, so we're just going to play on that forever. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go over to MSNBC because that's like a small part of my division that, Fox News isn't covering. So there are plenty of things that the news could cover every night that would actually bring people together, but the way in which they have to sort of show that they're different is by playing up those divisions. Because otherwise it's like, it doesn't really matter if I go to one news network or the other one because I feel good watching both of them. So they're like, let's heighten up the division part, and I'm going to give you something the other news network doesn't, and that thing happens to be very, partisan political stuff that makes everybody very angry. All right, so that's when divisions happen. All right, consubstantiation is when people try to increase overlap. So consubstantiation is if you and I are different, I'm going to consciously try to find ways in which we are similar. This is what politicians do a lot, all right, because they have to, right? Because politicians are very different than us. Politicians, the majority of them today, I don't think that this was the way the system was meant to be. That's a whole other conversation, but this is the way the system currently is. The majority of politicians now have law degrees, right? I don't think that that's what the founders intended, for every politician to be an Ivy League grad with with a law degree. However, that's what it is, right? So politicians are very different because most of them went to, Ivy League. Most of them have law degrees or some sort of advanced degrees. Um, most of them sort of hang out in upper middle class to upper class circles, right? The sort of like country club lifestyle, right? And I'm not degrading people who have any of these things. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of people in the country who don't have those things, who don't have those backgrounds, and it'd be nice to one have them represented with somebody, and it'd be nice to just see like a high school graduate in Congress, which there was at one point. I think Kristi Noem has this really cool story where she actually finished her college degree while she was already in Congress, and now she's the governor of South Dakota. I think something happened where like a family emergency made her drop out of college, and anyway, you can check out her story somewhere else. However, politicians are not like the average American, so they try to identify with them by doing all these like cutesy little like the Iowa State Fair. Let's go and like shove corn dogs and funnel cakes into our face, and let's try to dress down. We're not going to dress in a suit and tie all the time. We're going to sort of dress a little bit more casually. Some of the things from like the 2016 election that came out, like Hillary Clinton, like probably still to this day, but at least when she was running, she had sort of had this comment that everyone's like, oh my God, that's incredible. She didn't do it to sort of seem elitist, but she just kind of let it slip out, and people realized like, oh, she's not really like us. So in 2016, she had talked about how she hadn't driven a car in over 20 years, which makes sense, right? It's like she was the first lady starting in 1993, and then she became a U.S. senator, right? She is like, she's in like the top 10 like most important political families in the United States, probably top 5, but it's like, yeah, of course there's going to be just like Secret Service and drivers and everybody else around her like 24/7. Like it totally makes sense that she's never driven a car, or she hasn't driven a car for over 20 years. But when this sort of slipped out, you realize like that's not my lifestyle. That's very different than me. But Hillary Clinton has to figure out a way to sort of connect with people who haven't been surrounded by this like Washington D.C. security bubble, and again, for justifiable reasons. Right? She lived in this Washington, D.C. security bubble for very important reasons, for 20 plus years. But because of that, like she's got to find a way to connect with people in 2016 for when she's running for president. A lot of people talk about, this was one of the reasons that Donald Trump had beaten her in 2016, because even though he has $1 billion, people would refer to him as like the blue collar billionaire. So even though he had all this money, he sort of talked the way that, your uncle would talk. Just sort of like very brash, used profanity, said things that you probably wouldn't want your uncle to say in front of polite company, but just sort of says it anyways. And even though he has all this money, you're like, okay, yeah, but I kind of know who that guy is because that guy lives around the corner from me, and he's just a little bit, he's pretty rough around the edges. Yeah, and it didn't seem fake, right? You do have these politicians who try to speak the same language. They try to, sort of, use this sort of, everyday talk of middle America, but it just seems very forced consubstantiation. Trump, you're like, no, he probably says exactly that all the time. He's probably not faking this. This is probably exactly who he is with regard to his language and his vocabulary. All right. Okay. And finally, all right. So Burke talks about the ways in which we use persuasive techniques or we speak in order to purge guilt, right? And so there's a couple different ways. So this is one aspect of like why we're speaking. So the first, so you need to know these, right? Victimage, mortification, scapegoating, and redemption. So victimage is when we try to purge guilt by explaining our actions and putting the reason for our actions on sort of like the larger society. Like there's all these outside forces that made me act in a certain way, right? Like I'm weak, or it's society's fault, or what. Like we've heard of these things. We've heard of this sort of like through whatever online culture there is, or where people talk about victim culture. It's like I did the thing. Like people totally realize, and like they say like I did the thing, but let me explain to you why I did the thing. Like it's not really it's my fault in that I did it, but it's not really my fault because there's just all this context involved. So really it's sort of like it's society's fault. And you're like, okay, like at some point, possibly true, right? Also, where's the line between like it's society's fault and like, I'm sorry society gave you a bad hand, but you need to be an adult now. Like I'm empathetic to the fact that not everybody is given the same Not everybody is dealt the same hand in life. But where's the line between like you were dealt a bad hand? That doesn't mean that you get to act like a jerk. All right. So that's what victimage is. It's like people are trying to speak themselves out of, they did it, right? They admit that like I did the thing, but let me explain to you why I did the thing. So I'm actually a victim here. Like me doing the thing, that means that I'm actually a victim here because, these contexts and pressures of society sort of made me do the thing. All right. That's victimage, trying to explain your bad actions. All right. Mortification is purging guilt by blaming yourself. This is the taking responsibility part. Like, yes, I did it, and here's why I did it, and I'm only responsible for it, right? So again, you're explaining it. Scapegoating is blaming others. Now, here's how it's a little bit different than victimage. Victimage is when you get into these sort of like higher theoretical conversations about like society and context and like my, dad didn't hug me enough kind of stuff. Scapegoating is you're not taking any blame for it. Like it was somebody else who did the thing, right? So victimage is like, yes, I did the thing, but there's these reasons why I did the thing. Scapegoating is like, no, like it's actually like that person did it. Like somebody else did it. Like somebody else is worse than me, or like maybe I was an accomplice to it. Like the crime was committed, but like it was actually Joe over here who was the mastermind behind it. Like take Joe to prison. Don't take me to prison. I'm an innocent bystander in all of this. All right, that's scapegoating. And then finally, redemption is making the decision not to repeat the action. So redemption is sort of mortification, right? So you say like, I did the thing, right? But like, here's the ways I'm going to remedy it as far as like, I'm not going to repeat the action in the future. All right. Know those 4 things, right? And again, down below, watch the video on Cicero and watch the video on dramatistic criticism that goes into more in depth about who Kenneth Burke is, right? You need to know that information for the test, so make sure that you watch it. All right, that's all I have. I'll see you all next time.